So, as many of you know, I've largely centered my life around financial independence. And I did that because I care a great deal around my own freedom, my own autonomy, my own ability to self actualize in life, right? As I'm sure if you're interested in financial independence, that's one of the main things that drew you to it. But also, I wanted to be able to protest against the power that work has over me. Now, the reason I mention that is because in this video, I wanted to basically riff on my thoughts as they pertain to AI, because it seems highly likely that AI is going to have a large impact on the economy, a large impact on our relationship with work, what work means, perhaps what it means to even be a human being. Now, I'm obviously not an expert in AI, but I don't think you need to be able to kind of have some models that help guide your decision making in terms of how all of this stuff might play out and how it might impact us, right? I'm very concerned about how this might impact me, my family, all of us, how it might impact our relationship with money, our freedom, our autonomy, our independence, our relationship with work. And I think there's this really interesting moment in time happening right now, particularly as it relates to the economy, because our economy is in this very, very strange spot. And that's because we've made all of this progress in what you could call the world of bits, but this progress has not necessarily translated to what you could call the world of atoms. And what I mean by that is we've made so much progress in the digital world, but that progress has not necessarily translated to the physical world. Think of it this way. Think of in just a few generations, like compared to our grandparents, how much technological devices have advanced, how much they have changed. But then look at the physical world and ask yourself, has the real world changed all that much? Are we traveling in a revolutionary way? Are we living in different homes, right? Have the structures of society changed that much? It's like, no, we're driving, the cars have gotten technologically better, but we're still driving cars. We're still driving them on the same roads. We're still living in the same homes. We're still going to the same hospitals, schools, grocery stores. All of that stuff, all the bones that were set up by our grandparents are still in place today. Haven't really changed that much. So while we have made incredible progress in this one side of the economy, hasn't translated to this other one. And so what you have is this very strange K-shaped economy, whereas if your career has aligned with the world of bits, then it's probably done very well. Whereas if your career has aligned with the world of atoms, the physical world, it probably has not done better than your grandparents on a relative basis, right? You can't build an amazing life for an entire family on a single modest income anymore, like my grandpa did. Like I talked about in that video series I made. It was like a little docu-series-esque thing where I went back to my hometown of Sudbury. I investigated how all of this stuff is materially impacting real people's lives. I looked at how my grandpa could do that and how I can't today, even though my grandpa, my dad, and me all lived in the same place, all worked for literally the same company, and we have a completely different economic landscape from one another. So you have progress in the world of bits, not in the world of atoms. You have this K-shaped economy. All of this is translating into what looks like a breakdown in the social contract. And the social contract is this idea that I get something back for what I put into society, right? I'm contributing something to society, mostly my labor. I'm contributing my labor to society through my job, and I should get some economic rewards back for that. This deal between us and society seems to be becoming increasingly less fair, to the point where people are undergoing various forms of protest against it. To some people, it might look like financial independence. To others, it might look like taking a more active role in politics. So the social contract is breaking down. Now, right on cue, as it's breaking down, AI is set to enter the picture, right? And it's kind of weird how it does seem to be as if this is on cue. And this is obviously very significant because everyone is kind of thinking of AI as the next technological revolution, right? It's how everyone is framing it. And they're thinking of it as the most significant technological development since the industrial age, but perhaps the greatest one over all the technological developments throughout history. Now, this is highly significant because in my studying of history that I underwent because I wanted to get to the bottom of the question of how does work work, right? That's one of the main reasons I wanted to look into financial independence, because I wanted to change my relationship with work, and changing my relationship with work meant studying the question, researching the question, how does work actually work? And that caused me to basically go through the beginnings of history and essentially go through the entire thread of how Western civilization developed, starting from hunter-gatherers all the way through Mesopotamia, Rome, medieval Europe, industrial era, Britain, America, all that stuff to today. And what you find when you research this is that technological revolutions always coincide with massive struggles for power. And whoever happens to come out on top in these power struggles is the one who is then able to essentially issue a new social contract to people. Now, I want to talk more in depth about how this process works in detail a little bit later, because what I want to get to first is how do we know that AI is actually going to do something like that, right? Because a very, very important and valid question we should be asking is, when it comes to AI, how much of this stuff is just marketing hype, is just people circulating all kinds of their own money through these various businesses, and there's no and these businesses, and it's just like a massive bubble and all this crazy stuff. How much of that is true versus how much of it is true that this stuff could lead to genuine crazy breakthroughs? Like, how much of it is true that this stuff could genuinely be super intelligent, or that it could lead to genuine novel breakthroughs beyond what the human mind is capable of? Because we see proof of kind of both of these things. We've seen proof that, yeah, actually, it has led to some pretty genuinely novel discoveries, right? Even just stuff as simple as the way it might play a board game like Go, being able to play it in a completely different way than a human being would play. You could objectively say that is a novel development. But on the other hand, it looks a lot like there is a lot of smoke and mirrors, there is a lot of circular money. Seems very bubbly, you could say. Well, obviously, I'm not an AI expert, so I can't speak to the technological capabilities of this stuff like an AI researcher would be. But fortunately, they've made a lot of their research public, and a lot of these people from OpenAI, Anthropic, and other research teams have written some very lengthy and interesting papers that we can read and make our own assessments. So I've read them. I've read as much as I could possibly get my hands on. And the first useful model I think of when thinking about AI in general is this. It comes from Max Tegmark's Life 3.0 work. Basically, he frames it this way. There's three forms of life that we seem to have developed and be developing. So we have life 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. 1.0 corresponds to basic biological life. So think things like bacteria. Life 1.0 is incapable of modifying or designing its own hardware or software. What I mean by that is hardware is something's physical body, and software is what is running that body. So think something like a mind. Basic biological life like bacteria doesn't really have any software to speak of, and its hardware is extremely simple, right? And it can't design or modify either of these things. Like bacteria can't become something else of its own will. So life 1.0 is limited in this regard. Life 2.0, on the other hand, is complex biological organisms like us. And specifically, I want to talk about human beings in this regard. And that's because Life 2.0 can kind of sort of modify its own hardware, but not really, right? Like, think of how much we can modify our own bodies. We can create things like prosthetic limbs and technological devices like wheelchairs, but we can't do things like grow an extra arm or sprout wings or make any major modifications to our bodies, to our hardware. What we can do, though, is we actually can make some pretty good modifications to our software, right? The way our mind is running. That's because we can learn things. We can change our mental models, we can change our languages, we can learn math, we can learn science, we can read, we can write. And so this enables us to somewhat be able to actually start modifying our own software. And this is significant. That's why we correspond to life 2.0. Now, life 3.0, on the other hand, this corresponds to technological life. And technological life is going to be able to modify and design and upgrade both its hardware and its software. Basically, think of AI being able to manufacture and then embody itself within a robotic form. It's going to be able to design whatever form that body looks like, and it's going to be able to design and modify the software that's actually running it. So when you think of it this way, you can see that life 1.0, evolution had to evolve both its hardware and its software. For life 2.0, evolution had to evolve its hardware and its software, but then we gained the ability to start modifying the software. Life 3.0, evolution doesn't have to do any of that stuff. It's immediately going to be able to design, modify, upgrade its own hardware, its own software. So all of that is to say, basically, that life 1.0 and 2.0 are at least somewhat limited by biology. It constrains them. Life 3.0 is not going to be constrained by biology in any significant way, right? So when you think of it in that general sense, you can kind of understand why there's all this hysteria around it, right? Why people like Elon Musk describe us human beings as essentially biological bootloaders for the next phase of evolution. And things get kind of freaky in that regard. Now, how much of that is actually possible, though? Like, still, that might be an interesting way to frame it, but is that actually seriously how things are going to play out? Is that seriously what is going to happen here? Again, not a technical expert myself, but if you were to read things like Leopold Aschenbrunner's situational awareness paper or the AI 2027 paper, or things that people like Dario Amati have written, or crazy books like the one Ray Kurzweil have written, all of these signs essentially point to the idea that around the year 2027, maybe 2028, all of these research teams they're aligning on modeling the fact that they believe we are going to achieve something that is extremely significant in 2027 or around 2028. And that thing they believe that is going to be extremely significant is what is called recursive self-improvement. Now, recursive self-improvement is this idea that AI is going to gain the ability to modify, to work on, and then modify and upgrade itself better than a human being can. And this is not the exact same thing necessarily, but it roughly aligns probably with the achievement of what you could call AGI, or artificial general intelligence. Now, when you achieve these things, if it is possible to achieve these things, you potentially create this runaway effect where AI gains the ability to start improving itself faster than a human being can. And this can quickly then kind of accelerate away into what you might describe as artificial superintelligence, right? We've kind of exceeded the cognitive capacity of human beings at this point. Maybe this is an AI that is smarter than the smartest human being on Earth, or it is smarter than the totality of humanity combined, depending on how you want to look at it, how you want to define it. If something like that were achieved, shortly after 2027, 2028, obviously that's where things could get very, very freaky. But here's where I think the hype gets a little bit ahead of itself. And that's because while I do think it is very possible that something like recursive self-improvement does get achieved around 2027, sorry, there's just a big loud sound outside. You have this lag, like I was talking about earlier, between progress in the world of bits and progress in the world of atoms. So even if you do achieve a super, super intelligent AI in just a few short years, the totality of effects from that are going to take a pretty long period of time to reach out into the physical world, right? Take something like manufacturing robot or humanoid robots, for instance. So right now on the market, you can see there's a couple different humanoid robots that you can actually buy, and there's a lot of different presentations that companies have been giving showing off the robots that they're manufacturing. Now, a lot of these robots, basically all these robots, aren't actually useful yet, right? Like they can't do anything helpful around the house yet. They're not really going to be replacing any workers yet. Definitely not there. But they're going to get there, and they're probably going to get there pretty fast. The thing is, though, what's not going to be fast is the capability to manufacture millions or billions of these things. That is going to take a very, very long time to actually scale up because it takes a huge amount of real world resources to organize to be able to manufacture that many. So all of this is to say, even if you get these things really, really good or really technologically capable, the impacts of that are going to get pushed out into the 2030s and 2040s because that's when this stuff is going to be able to be deployed at scale, right? And that's why I think I'm pretty much aligned with someone like Dwarkesh on this, where we are probably massively overestimating what AI is going to do to the world in the next couple of years, but we're probably also massively underestimating what it's going to do in the next few decades. And I think somebody who kind of illustrates that case in a very clear way is someone like Ray Kurzweil. If you're not familiar with him, he kind of became a little bit more mainstream famous for writing his book, The Singularity is Near, which he wrote around the year 2000. And Ray Kurzweil is this technologist guy. He's involved with all of these different technology projects. Companies won all kinds of technological awards for his research and his companies and all of these types of things. But basically wrote this book that was predicting how AI and these technologies were going to develop about 2 decades into the future. So he's writing around the year 2000, predicting things out unto where we're at today. And Ray was essentially right in most of his biggest predictions about how things would play out. Everyone at the time, around the year 2000, thought he was crazy for calling what he was calling for. And he was also roughly calling for the achievement of, things like passing the Turing test or artificial general intelligence, achieving that basically around 2027, when all of these people are now being like, hey, we might actually achieve that around, oh, wait, exactly when this guy said we would. So he might be someone worth paying attention to because he might have some pretty good models for how he thinks about this stuff. And we don't really have to get into it, but the way he models it is basically, I think it was Moore's law, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it has to do with kind of a computing law that describes how progressive AI is likely to play out, and it pretty much follows this law pretty accurately. So Ray wrote another book very recently, I think it was like a year ago, called The Singularity is Nearer, which is kind of a funny title. The first one is The Singularity is Near. This one's The Singularity is Nearer. And the idea is he's making a new set of 20-year out predictions again, because he's like, hey, my last ones weren't so bad. Let's do it again. And what he's calling for now, again, to people living at our present time, seems crazy, because what he's calling for is essentially the singularity to occur by the year 2045. And the singularity is basically this idea of the merging of man and machine, this crazy harmony between AI, robotics, nanotechnology and human beings. And in that type of world, basically, he's envisioning we are going to have the technological capabilities to achieve things like longevity escape velocity. So think we are going to add more than 1 year to our lifespan for every single year we live. So in other words, you are gaining more lifespan every year you live, to the point where you potentially could prolong life indefinitely. In addition to that, you could also envision kind of like a cyberpunky world where we are able to modify our physical bodies to replace the meat we have, the muscle, skin, and bone, with essentially like nanoparticle 3D printed better bodies that are made out of more durable and powerful materials and stuff like that. So we kind of become these like cyborg-like beings. And I mean, why stop there? He's also describing how we could gain the technological capabilities, again, through the intersection of AI and nanotechnology is a huge, huge part of this. The ability to essentially upgrade our brains to do crazy stuff like connect them directly to the internet, the cloud. In other words, giving our minds access to the totality of knowledge, being able to access that perfectly and have perfect memory and crazy cognition through basically increasing our neural architecture so that we have way more layers of abstraction. Easy way to think about that is like if you look at something like a dog, for instance, if you look at a dog's brain, they are limited by the layers of abstraction they have in their brain, by the amount of neuronal, I don't even know if that's a word, but like neuronal connections between neurons, right? That create layers of abstract thinking. We can think more abstractly, right? We can think kind of more complex, higher order thoughts than something like a dog can because of our neural architecture. And if you could add even more layers to our neural architecture, then it's at least theoretically possible that then we could also think in even higher abstract ways that we can't comprehend in this very moment. So all of that is to say is basically you're kind of creating superhumans. And what I mean by that is you are then basically taking the ability to modify humans' hardware and software, right? And creating superhuman beings who are no longer limited by their biology. Sorry if you hear my little boy yelling in the background. So in that type of world, basically you have this very, very strange thing happen where when you think about that type of technology, do you think that type of technology is going to be distributed evenly to everybody? I mean, probably not, right? So you can see this world where it's either like utopically good or dystopically bad, because on the one hand you could say, yeah, if it is distributed to everybody evenly, then this is amazing, because this is also the type of world where, well, if AI and robotics and nanotechnology are this advanced, then it's like that stuff is obviously going to be able to do all the labor, right? There is not going to be a reason for a human being to have to work anymore. And so in that type of world, there would ideally be this like massive abundance, and there's not exactly really a need for like money anymore, but maybe there's still some type of credit system or however it works. I'm not entirely sure, but whether it's UBI or something like David Shapiro did a pretty interesting series on post-labor economics. It's like a lecture series he put together. Check that out if you haven't seen it. It's very cool. Might look a lot like that. But anyways, all of this is to say that, yeah, it could look utopically good or dystopically bad. And the reason I say this is because I think we can learn a lot from looking at how history has progressed through technological revolutions and kind of play that forward to what might play out here and get an idea of which direction between good or bad it can go in. And I think one of the most useful models for thinking about this is historical materialism. Now, in talking about historical materialism, I'm probably going to piss a lot of people off who are like experts in historical materialism, because the way I like to think about it and the way I like to describe it is not exactly textbook, but it's the way that I think actually works pretty well and has worked pretty well for me. So this is the way I like to describe it. Basically, in terms of civilization, you have these two main structures. You have what is known as the economic base, and then you have what is known as the superstructure. Superstructure sounds crazy. It's not that crazy. The economic base is really easy. It's just how the main stuff of the economy is produced at a particular point in time in a civilization. So for instance, in the agricultural age, when civilization's entire economies were centered around farming and agriculture, the economic base was agricultural land, right? That's what you wanted to capture and control. If you could capture and control agricultural land, it meant you captured and you controlled the economic base, which meant you controlled the main stuff of the economy. Now, the other part, the superstructure, comes into play because whoever happens to capture and control the economic base then gets to put in place the superstructure on top of it. And the superstructure is essentially all the institutional layers of civilization that help enforce control of the economic base. So all the institutional layers of civilization are things like the political system, the military system, the legal system, the financial system, education system, media propaganda system, even religious systems, right? Those are all essentially created by the holders of the economic base to help them continue to hold it. So if you think of like in the agricultural age, think of Rome controlling massive amounts of agricultural land, right? Their economy very much depended on controlling massive amounts of agricultural land, things like these massive latifundia plantations, they were called, and slaves to work those. Rome essentially, maybe one of the best ways to think about the superstructure is all the civilizational myths that hold a society together, right? So they had all these various religious myths. You can think of, the legal system is a myth, right? It's not real. These laws don't like exist physically in reality, but everyone kind of buys into following them because if you don't, there are real physical consequences for not doing it, right? So all these civilizational myths of the political system, the legal system, the military system, they all helped enforce Rome's control over the agricultural land. Now, why I talk about this is because when a technological revolution happens, right, like the transition from the agricultural age to the industrial age, what's happening is a new economic base is created to compete over, to fight over, to try and control. Right? Agricultural land went from being the most important thing to now factories, manufacturing capabilities, control of natural resource inputs to those factories and industrial processing, right? That became the new economic base that you wanted to compete over. So when that happens, you have this competition for power, and whoever wins that competition then gets to put in place the new superstructure, the new layer of civilizational myths that come in to help control it. So if we think about the climax of the industrial age, if we think about World War I and World War II, the Western democratic order won those wars and kind of won control more or less for the foreseeable future. They won control of the economic base in a sense, right? And because they won control of that, they then got to impress the Western democratic order over all the economic bases that they controlled. And the reason that the political system takes the form it does, the reason the reason we have capitalism, the reason we have representative democracy, the reason our legal system takes the shape it does, the reason our education system, right, very much takes the shape it does, is because it's all predicated upon the ability for our current control of the economic base to work. It's like this is kind of the optimal way to entrench and reinforce control over what is now like what you could call the late industrial age. So it's like it doesn't rely so much on manufacturing capabilities as now it's starting to really rely on things like information technology, right? And so the best environment for these information technology companies and businesses to operate in is a democratic capitalist free market, more or less, environment. So that's why it takes the shape it does. So basically, this is a story of as technological changes happen, new economic bases become available to compete over. Whoever wins that competition then kind of gets to decide how they're going to enforce the new civilizational myths and social contract that comes as a result of that. So if you've ever wondered, like, oh, why do these things take the form they do today? Well, it's largely to enforce control of what the economic base currently is. Now, all of this is very significant because it looks as though if this truly is a technological revolution we are undergoing right now that is as significant or more significant than something like the Industrial Revolution, then it means that artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotechnology, all of these things are going to be a new economic base to compete over. And unfortunately, that means that it might be a little bit turbulent and there might be conflicts involved in that. Not necessarily hot ones. I mean, you can kind of look at what's happening right now and say that we have a lot of data points that support that is pretty much what's happening right now. You can look at what's happening both internally and externally, right? These kind of cold conflicts. They're not necessarily hot conflicts, but you can look at conflicts between companies. You could look at how CEOs are just fighting each other. Look at Elon and Sam Altman going at it with each other. You can also look at how the government is increasingly transitioning the economy towards state capitalism, right? I don't think a lot of people notice this yet, but it's very much transitioning towards state capitalism, which is very much posturing you find in conflict environments, right? Very much happened around the world wars. What I mean by state capitalism is the government is now increasingly trying to capture and control and influence key parts of the economy. Look at how many stakes in businesses that the US government is taking at the moment, right? Whether it's Intel, whether it's rare earth businesses, whether it's energy related things. It's like, why did they take a 10% stake in Intel? It's because they want to turn Intel into a domestic Taiwan semiconductor company, right? Because TSMC is the chip fab for the entire world right now. The entire world is relying on them so much, but they're in Taiwan, and that is an extremely vulnerable place to be at this moment in time, right? Super vulnerable. So the US government is like, oh no, we need a domestic chip fab because there literally isn't one. Intel is not, no one wants their chips from Intel, but the US government is like, we have to make Intel into an amazing domestic chip fab, right? So they're like this. They're playing an extremely active role in this. This is state capitalism. This is akin to wartime, kind of. Well, I don't know if maybe it's not as severe as that, but it's like it's clearly progressing in that direction, and that's because there's this. The geopolitical backdrop is essentially it's like a cold arms race to see if it's possible to develop things like superintelligence, but who can develop it first, right? Because it's a significant economic and military and, all of these things advantage if you can. Perhaps in some ways as significant as, like a nuclear arms race. So you have that backdrop there, which is highly, highly significant. Now, if it is true that there is a conflict unfolding for what could be the next economic base, you could kind of continue to play that forwards and then maybe speculate on what the world looks like then in something like the 2040s, right? Let's say you do achieve all these things that Ray Kurzweil talks about. Let's say you do achieve the ability to be superhuman, this kind of crazy stuff, and let's say there is some type of new social contract that is put in place because the forces of historical materialism continue to play out the way they've always played out. So what could that social structure and social contract look like? Well, if I were to speculate, for fun, and this is just total speculation, but my guess would be that the postmodern world is going to go pre-modern again. And what I mean by that is, if you think of this time we live in as kind of like the postmodern world, right? So what comes after the postmodern world, right? The postmodern world is another pre-modern world. And what I mean by that is, if we think of the pre-modern world as essentially something like the high medieval ages, what I'm saying is, I think we might return back to pre-modern social structures, things like monarchies, feudal structures. I don't think we'll necessarily call it that, but that is the form our social relationships and power structures might take. And part of the reason I think that is because of Polybius's Cycles of History. I'm not going to go over it in this video. I talked about it in a previous one. I can link it for you. But yeah, that's kind of my highest conviction at the moment. And part of the reason I think that is because, so let's say you get superhuman technologies, right? My guess would be those technologies do not get distributed evenly, because the way they'll probably initially get distributed is to who can afford them, right? So the rich and powerful will be the first ones to access these technologies. And then they'll probably eventually be like, you know what, I don't want everyone to have them, because if everyone has them, it's a lot harder to kind of put the population into a hierarchy, right? So most likely what you're going to get is essentially a neo-nobility class and a neo-peasantry class. We already kind of have that today, but it's going to be further exacerbated because the neo-nobility class will essentially be superhuman, and the neo-peasantry class will be just normal people. And the neo-peasantry class will probably be utterly economically dependent on the neo-nobility class. They already largely are today, but that'll just get exacerbated. And so, you might have this weird relationship where it's like, if you want to receive your UBI or you want to receive your access to resources and stuff like this, you more or less have to pledge your fealty to some type of lordship structure. And I mean, working for a corporation today is already largely like that, but again, it's just like extending that further and kind of solidifying that relationship. So all of that is to say, basically, I'm choosing to make a Pascal's wager of sorts on all of this stuff. And, it's kind of the idea that, okay, Pascal's wager is like, I can't know whether or not God actually exists, so I'm just going to live as if they do, because if they don't exist, well, then I don't lose anything because I've probably lived my life as a good human being. But if they do exist, well, great. I've lived my life as a good human being, so hopefully I'm going to go to heaven. I tend to think about AI very much the same way, in the sense that I'm going to prepare for the future as if a lot of this crazy stuff is going to happen, because if it doesn't, well, then that's great. I'm just better prepared to face like a continuously declining economy that we're in. Or I'm also positioned to face whatever crazy stuff actually happens, right? And financial independence this is where financial independence becomes highly significant, because dependence is the primary axis of control across history. And I see no reason why that won't continue. And so financial independence is the antidote to that control. Sorry, my camera ran out of memory there. I'm going to start talking a lot about particularly the beginning aspect of starting your journey to financial independence, particularly the $0 to $100,000 range, because I think that is the most important and it's the most significant. I think that if you're beyond that, then you're largely like, if you're able to do that for yourself, then you should be able to continue to hopefully progress in a direction that's going to be good for you. If you're still within that range, right? If you're anywhere between 0 and 100, I think it is very important that over the next couple years that someone does their utmost to achieve that. because if you don't have it and this type of future does play out, you're going to be very, 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 very dependent, and it's going to be a very, very precarious position to be in. So I want to try and help out in that regard if I can. I think the $0 to $100,000 is the hardest range. I think it's the most important for getting your first taste of financial independence, your first taste of getting some of your autonomy and power over yourself back. And so I think it's what I want to focus on talking about. In addition to all the other stuff I've been talking a lot about, like we'll definitely continue to explore the question of how work works and that type of stuff. But I just wanted to inject my thoughts as my big riff, I guess you could say, on AI at this very weird moment of time we're in, how it might continue to play out, how it also happens to intersect with things like financial independence. And so hopefully that just wasn't a crazy ramble that went all over the place. Hopefully it was somewhat cohesive and comprehensive and comprehensible. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that at this moment. Thank you for hanging out with me. And yeah, we'll talk about, achieving that first little bit of financial independence for yourself soon. Take care till then.